Hello everyone, this is Menz here. I'm going to be breaking down the Object 257's armor here in this weak spot guide video. Now I have a fully written guide as well. There's a link in the video description, and also there'll be a little link to click at the end of the video and it'll pop up there. It's a little bit more in depth to where I'm going to basically go over the main areas that you're going to find on the Object 257 here, and also kind of explain its unique armor scheme a bit. So before I begin, more or less, because looking here, you'll notice that the hull, it's a diamond shape to where the sides basically angle in at a pretty steep angle, and they're going to cause a lot of shells to ricochet off of it. However, from the front, you still have the traditional lower Glacius weak spot, which is 198 millimeters effective here. So most tanks that face the Object 257, outside of a few like tier 7 tanks or some unfortunate stock tier 8s, will be able to penetrate the lower Glacius fairly easily. So no worries there outside of, make sure you aim towards the center, since, it is a diamond shape. If you start aiming towards the sides, the likelihood of you hitting the upper Glacius or nothing, greatly increases. The upper Glacius, given a pike nose and looking at it head on here, 288 millimeters effective, so really difficult to penetrate, and there is a chance to ricochet if you're shooting AP or APCR. Heat shells, that ricochet goes out of the window for the most part. However, it is still fairly tough to penetrate it. There is a overmatch spot, in the driver viewport area here, basically a little triangle in between the two pike nose Glacius pieces. That's 45 millimeters thick. So basically you need over 135 millimeter on your round caliber to actually overmatch it. So if you have a 130 millimeter gun, it's just going to bounce off. Even with heat, if you have 150 millimeter, you're going to be able to overmatch it. Now moving up a little bit on the turret, basically, unless you're shooting higher up at the cupolas and the roof, most of the turret is not worth shooting at. The weakest area, say on the Mantlet, outside of right around the gun that most tanks have, but it's really difficult to hit around the gun. The only technically a weak spot on the Mantlet, basically right to the right of the gun, is up to 293 millimeters thick. So as far as effective armor, so it's not even worth trying, honestly, unless you're spamming gold out of a tier 10 TD. Moving up though to the cupolas, the center of the cupola is technically the weakest area on the tank. Frontally, a little bit smaller to hit than the lower Glacius. They sit 158 to 168 millimeters effective. And then when you get to the very outer edges, 274, and right beneath the cupolas, basically this slope piece, except for the very outer edge of it, that's 275 millimeters effective. Now the other place of note is basically on the roof. So let me pull my overlay off here. This area is 30 millimeters thick, basically this somewhat rectangle shape here. So you're going to be able to overmatch that if you have over a 90 millimeter size for your round. So if you have a 90 millimeter gun shooting at it, it's just going to bounce off. If you have, say, a 100 millimeter, 105 millimeter gun, you'll be able to overmatch this, given that it's only 30 millimeters thick. To know where to aim at it, so if you're kind of looking at the 257, granted this is pretty close, it's harder to see further away. You see this little black strip here, so you want to aim just right above that, because anywhere below that you're hitting the Mantlet. That little black strip's basically the top little flap above the Mantlet here. So anything above that, 30 millimeters here, you're penetrating. If you can overmatch it, if you have above 90 millimeters on your caliber, but 90 itself won't work. But the center of the cupolas are also weak, and this little area here is that 275 millimeters effective. So frontally, pretty straightforward. That's not the problem that most people are going to have with the 257. The problem comes with the side, which I had to clip a little bit of this to get it to kind of line up right. So the 257, the problem comes with its side armor, given that it's angled in like a diamond, basically to the bottom of the lower hull. So starting at the bottom here, there's not a lot of hull armor behind the tracks. Honestly, you want to shoot above these three wheels here in the center, shooting basically into them or even below, you're not going to hit any hull armor. You're just wasting your time. You're just shooting air behind it. But basically from the top of these up to the top of this kind of teal area, you're shooting armor that's 45 millimeters thick. So again, you can overmatch it if you have basically 136 millimeter or higher for your round. You're shooting, you know, this area is 45 millimeters thick, angled at 68 degrees, and most of the time you're going to be shooting down at it unless you're shooting, say, beneath the Object 257. If it's like on a hill or a cliff and you're shooting up at it, you're going to basically ricochet off of it unless you have a chance to overmatch it. So some might say, you know, with heat, that basically doesn't ricochet until, you know, at a higher angle, 80 degrees. The problem with that is basically you're trying to thread a needle in between the top of the tracks here and this spaced armor. It's really not worth doing it because 9 times out of 10 or even higher, you're basically gonna have your heat shell get lost in the space armor or the track. So unless you have, you know, a chance to overmatch it against the 45 millimeters of hull armor on the lower side hull, it's not worth shooting this area unless you're like really shooting up at a high angle so you don't bounce off. You know, it's just not worth doing it. Otherwise, you know, whether you can overmatch or not, basically remember, if you're looking at the side, given the diamond shape, the road wheels, or not, I don't even know what they're called, the front and back, basically track wheels I'll call them, if you shoot them, you're not going to cause any hull damage behind them, given that the hull is, you know, it's a diamond shape and it kind of floats, it seems like. I'll give a closer look at the end. But basically, where do you shoot this thing? So before I get to the main weak spot, there is a small little strip here. It's 239 millimeters effective. So if you do end up, say, tracking this and it's stuck and not able to shoot you around a corner, you can, even if you can't overmatch it, because if you can overmatch it, you're better just shooting that area to overmatch the 45 millimeters. Here's a very small, thin strip that's 130 millimeters thick at the edge of the kind of upper Glacius area. However, it's not at a basically auto bounce angle, so you can penetrate it if you have, you know, adequate penetration. That runs basically right along here, and that becomes what I call the middle side hull over here. So on the side here, that's 237 through 248 millimeters effective, given that there's still spaced armor on it. So it gets kind of toggling the overlay here. I'm talking about basically the top part of the spaced armor, where you see these three kind of storage areas. So right above that's the main weak spot. That's the upper side hull. That's 202 millimeters effective. Once you factor in normalization a little bit, it'll be a little bit weaker than that, so even tier 7s can penetrate this. The weakest area though is the rear upper side hull, 188, or not 188, 180 millimeters effective. And then the side turret's really strong, honestly. It's not worth shooting unless you're in a tier 9 or even a tier 10 tank, and even then, unless you're shooting out of like a tank destroyer or a premium round, there's still a chance to bounce unless you're hitting basically the top of the cupola on the side, which is very small to actually hit that the majority of the time. But basically, the side armor on this is what makes this tank difficult to penetrate, because looking quickly at the rear hull here, it's not, you know, it's not that special. The main thing to remember from this, I'm just going to line it up somewhat well here. Main thing to remember, which toggling this, it looks like a square, the lower rear hull. However, you can kind of see the diamond outline to where there's no hull armor on those areas. They're kind of part of the tracks. You're either going to cause track damage or basically 0 damage critical hit and do nothing. So you're better off just sticking to the green areas, back of the turret, you know, basically the rear hull outside of the false little areas here. Now, looking at the tracks a little bit closer, you'll notice that there's a pretty big gap in between the tracks and the side hull. So if you come across this thing angled, you're still better for most tanks, unless you don't have penetration and you kind of are stuck shooting the cupolas. But for most tier 8s and especially 9s and 10s, as an Object 257 angles, you're better off still shooting at the lower plate because it's still going to be beneath say 250 millimeters effective, or as it starts angling more, shooting basically the unangled piece of the pike nose. The reason being, you can penetrate here, but it's still fairly strong unless they start over angling a lot, and even in that case you can still penetrate this area here. But basically, if the Object 257 is angled just a little bit like this, and you're shooting at the track area thinking that you can overmatch, if you hit this, so basically you have a very high chance for your shell to just be absorbed into the track, because the amount of distance it has to travel through the track and then hit the side hole behind it it's pretty far, to where, you know, it's definitely not worth shooting heat at. That's not going to work, obviously, but even AP and APCR will struggle going through, to where if it's angled and you do want to like not risk not being able to penetrate the lower glacis, you can overmatch it like shooting without hitting the track here. But most of the time it's still better to shoot the lower glacis, shoot the pike nose that's unangled. Most people know this by now, to where the pike nose gets most of its strength pointing frontally right at you unangled, but once you do it, you know, shooting the area closest to you is basically the easiest way to pen this thing. But anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this weak spot guide video and I could help you out a bit here. Again, I have a written guide. A little link's going to pop up on the right side of the screen here at the end. Otherwise, there is a link in the video description below. Basically, if you're going to be coming across one of these things, keep in mind the 45mm spots on the driver viewport area and also the lower side hole, to where, you know, you need 136mm or higher on your caliber to overmatch. So just keep that in mind, because otherwise this tank is going to be really frustrating to fight against, but it isn't undefeatable. It's just, you know, it's a little bit tricky essentially, and there's no other tank currently. The closest is like the Object 907 with the hull angled like this is. So anyway, thanks again for watching. Have a very nice day. See you around sometime soon again.